Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law, editor of the Digest. My guest today is Sara Segneri. Sara is a partner at Accompany Strategies. She's a specialist in sanctions law and international financial crime. Her remit covers international law, human rights, war crimes, cross-border finance, and foreign policy. Sara and a cohort of fellow lawyers have formed a pro bono organization, Bystanders No More, in support of Palestine and the Palestinian people. Sara, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Sara, you are a human rights lawyer and a financial crime specialist, but you're also a specialist on war crimes and cross-border finance, and you're the co-author of a recently released paper from Bystanders No More. It's titled Investment Risks in Occupied Palestinian Territory. And as the paper makes very clear, new risks have emerged for investors because of how Israel has chosen to prosecute its war, that is, the genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing in the occupied territories. So what has changed, and what should investors and financial institutions be now thinking about?
Thanks, Bill. This was a really important project, I think, and it's just the beginning of a lot of work that's yet to come. Essentially, we looked at the fact that the risk environment for investors and financial institutions has changed materially in a very short period. Once the International Court of Justice ruled that the occupation was unlawful, once UN bodies extensively documented genocide and crimes against humanity, and as those findings have accumulated into an overwhelming legal record, litigation around the world, investigations, and pressures on those who are profiting from this. And so, for investors and financial institutions, what had once been treated as more of a values or an ESG type debate really moved into a very hard and concrete legal and fiduciary risk category. And because of this and because of the growing body of business and human rights due diligence, you have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, increased pressures on states to enforce the companies operating within their borders to comply with human rights law, as well as the shifting public sentiments and policy decisions by multiple governments around the world. And so where we're at is that we don't just have marginal signals or hints that there might be risks for financial institutions and investment companies. Their risk management, their duties to investors, to shareholders, to people who are entrusting their money with these organizations have now become extremely serious, very much at the forefront, and continuing to invest in anything related to the occupied territories, the settlements, or even broader, and taking this beyond just Israel-Palestine, but looking at other conflict zones. This really can't be seen as neutrality or not taking sides in a conflict. This is active risk-taking in defiance of law. And so this initial briefing was created looking at institutional investors, their boards, trustees, leadership, executives, anyone making these decisions, and everything from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurers, asset managers, but especially those who think they might be insulated from liability or accountability. But this is also a bit of a flag for investors so that they can start to demand actual meaningful due diligence and responsible and ethical investments from companies. This isn't about activism or policy. This is about the fiduciary duties that these entities have, their risks of legal exposures, and growing concerns about misplaced risk that these companies are engaging in.
Okay, well, let's look at the legislation that is in place in the EU and the UK that treats with products coming out of the illegal occupation in the West Bank. And I suppose the investment coming in to these illegal settlements, as you say, this is a kind of an alert to various institutional organizations to, hey, here's what's in the legislation. Here's what you need to know. So tell us a little more about that legislation, sir.
Certainly. And to keep it brief, because I think we could spend probably a whole day digging into some of this, at the highest level, the legal baseline that the legal briefing leans on is the International Court of Justice, the ICJ's advisory opinion, and that the opinion doesn't just criticize contacts, it frames third state obligations. It specifically says that states should abstain from economic or trade dealings that could entrench the unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. And that's what really becomes the reference point for both trade and investment risk analysis. Is that when you have a ruling from the highest court in the world as to the occupation, how can you then invest in and profit from something that has been deemed illegal? Within the EU, there's the few primary things to look at. Individual countries may have their own laws as to business and human rights due diligence for corporations or financial institutions, as well as binding IHL. If you start looking into international humanitarian law and the requirements there, Germany has a supply chain due diligence act. France has a duty of vigilance law, and the EU has their corporate sustainability due diligence directive. Now, these laws don't only touch upon products, they reach financing and value chain exposure. And that's where settlement linked investment risk shows up in practice in these situations. On top of that, right now, the EU is actively reviewing and I believe has proposed suspending parts of the EU-Israel Association Agreement under the human rights clauses. And this is a very real near-term regulatory trigger for investors and something that they should be concerned about and actively planning as to how they're going to handle this. There's also heightened attention to arms export restrictions and dual use scrutiny expanding across member states, including a lot of litigation and advocacy throughout the EU. And this then poses a serious compliance risk for companies and financiers in sensitive supply chains.
Mm. What about the UK? I mean, we've kind of split from the EU, but is the legislation here similar to what's on the books in Europe?
Yes, and so with the UK, whilst politicians again like to pretend this is abstract, UK-linked investors are exposed through domestic complicity frameworks and international criminal obligations. UK law already incorporates the Rome Statute, meaning that a company or an investment entity saying that we didn't know or we followed what the market was doing will not be a defense. The UK government is also presently facing litigation for its arms exports to Israel. It's taken action as to settlements in the West Bank. It's issued sanctions against entities. And so investment firms or financial institutions investing or profiting from either businesses or entities in the settlements, supporting the settlements, or military industrial complex, the MIG, must take this into consideration in what companies they're investing in. What are they holding in their portfolios? Are they going to have risks of non-compliance with IHL, exposure and litigation? So there definitely is a risk within the UK for this. And the UK International Criminal Court Act from 2001, which incorporates the Rome Statute, this really underlines why complicity analysis is a real legal exposure route that risk analysts in the corporate and financial sectors need to consider, particularly given that as we speak, there are proposed amendments to the International Criminal Court Act in the UK to allow for even broader liability under universal jurisdiction principles and who could be criminally prosecuted in the UK.
Interesting. Yeah, complicity analysis. So what exactly is complicity analysis?
So when you're doing complicity analysis, essentially you're going to look at what is the level of engagement of a company or a financial institution with actors who are committing atrocity crimes, human rights abuses, war crimes, or even your run-of-the-mill crimes. If you look at money laundering, terrorist financing, illegal arms exports, sanctions violations is an especially big one in this. And so if you are a properly acting corporation or financial institution, your legal and compliance teams are going to be making sure that everything that your entity does is in compliance with the law, both where you're headquartered, where you have subsidiaries, but also looking at who you're doing business with and ensuring that there isn't corruption or bribery or anything that could expose your corporation or financial institution to legal liability, either civilly or criminally.
Okay, but here's the thing, Sarah. with the genocide in Gaza, with the ethnic cleansing that's going on in the West Bank, the settler vigilante thugs driving Palestinians out of their homes, off their land. I mean, this legislation, is it not just effectively honored in the breach here in the UK and in Europe? So is it just not worth the paper it's printed on?
I cannot agree with you more on this. I mean, and I think this is something that we see especially with international law and systematically so. A lot of what we've documented in the briefing and what we're looking at even further is that this is not accidental failures or minimal negligence of enforcement, but this is structural avoidance. And I would go so far as to even say that it is implicitly or explicitly encouraged by sovereign states. That when leaders send messages about how they stand with a country and are sending aid and criticizing arrest warrants at the ICC or other things, that sends a message to corporations and investment entities and financial institutions that this is not an area that they need to, quote, be worried about, essentially. And I think a key example of this is that as the the atrocities and the genocide in Palestine and the growth of the settlements in the West Banks significantly increased. Many of the major human rights and corporate social responsibility raters, there are entities that kind of will issue ratings or risk analysis stating these are your concerns if you're operating in these areas or investing in these areas. And those ratings and reports are utilized and drawn upon by investors, by investment companies, by other corporations as they determine are we in compliance? Are we being a quote good ethical company? And as things escalated, these raters either withdrew or reduced their coverage on Israel-Palestine human rights issues. Even as legal risks were becoming more crystallized, as news coverage and investigations and other information expanded. And the result of this is that you have portfolios that might appear compliant, and they may say, we've undergone human rights screenings, we've analyzed everything in here, but many of them actually have settlement linked or conflict linked exposure. They may hold investments in settlement linked banks, arms suppliers, or sovereign debt funds that are financing war crimes. And this is, I think, particularly even for the UK, banks in the UK providing mortgages and financing to settlers in the West Bank. And so they're hiding behind what they say has been their due diligence. And essentially, laws exist, policies exist, but if those in power, if those who make the determinations of who will be prosecuted or who will face investigations or fines from the Serious Fraud Office or other aspects of the UK government, if they don't feel that this is an area that should be enforced, even though it is the law, they've essentially politically neutralized any enforcement, any action, just to allow the damage essentially to continue in the West Bank and in Palestine. The other point I think in here is a governance issue, especially for multilateral corporations and institutions, where they end up in kind of a regulatory collision where they may have EU compliance pressure on one side, US political pressure on another, UK kind of neutrality and not doing anything. And this then it also poses a risk for these investors and institutions because when you have these competing regulatory and I would say political decision making that's happening, and you have to make a decision on what do we comply with, what do we not comply with, if we decide to not do any business with the West Bank, are we going to run afoul with boycott, divestment, and that aspect, and then get hit with litigation or fines or investigations. And so these aspects as well add even more to the risk analysis that these institutions have to
Mm-hmm.
undergo.
So, what you're saying, Sarah, is that if I'm an investor, I could get dinged by the Americans if I choose not to invest. Meantime, there's pressure on the other side to do exactly that, to disinvest. It's a it's a bit of a bind, and as you say, something that corporate investors have to really think about. You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and the human rights lawyer Sara Segneri, who specializes in sanctions law and international financial crime. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to receive our daily newsletter for 2 months for free. Check us out at arabdigest.org. But okay, if I'm an investor, Sarah, and I'm looking at Israel, West Bank, settlements, what are the things I should be concerned about, assuming I'm prepared to ignore the genocide and the ethnic cleansing? That is, that making money overrides any moral concerns I might have. What would cause me to step back and say, well, maybe that's not such a good investment after all?
I think there's three primary things that investors should look at. And that's, if you have an investor which can entirely set aside ethics and morality and is just focused on wanting to make money. And sadly, in conflicts, in post-conflicts, we've seen this time and time again. Corruption and profit is rampant in these situations. And I think that's why, even as we talk about the reconstruction of Gaza, if the war ever ends, these are very, very real risks. And I also think, though, that what a lot of investors may not realize is that a lot of the risks also do end up being financial risks. Even if the investment itself might look like it's financially sound, down the road, the financial pitfalls that someone could face. And the first thing is regulatory or what's called forced exit risk. So, for example, if the EU took action that could force sudden divestment, that poses a huge risk for passive funds, sovereign bonds, or other strategies that can be vulnerable if there is a harsh exit. And I think one example of this is we saw, which also shows a bit of a double standard, when the Ukraine-Russia war started, and you saw companies fleeing Russia, getting their money out of the banks and halting their business dealings. As I mentioned, the EU-Israel agreement review has already moved to formal suspension proposals. And these types of triggers can force rapid de-risking, lead entities to make major changes, sometimes which would create very strong market losses. And so from that aspect, I think that's the first thing that investors, sometimes these investments may be riskier than they anticipated just from a shifting geopolitical and policy standpoint.
All right, worry number one as an investor, forced exit. Suddenly, things change very dramatically, and I lose my investment. What's my second worry?
The second thing is, we talked about complicity, and this is where the legal and litigation risks come in. As we have the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, we have the International Criminal Court, arrest warrants and investigations. The question then becomes whether investors and corporations really can truly show adequate due diligence and avoid knowingly contributing. And this goes from everything from anyone in the arms trade and the military industrial complex, the pending situation in Poland with the TNT that was produced, that has been used in the bunker buster bombs that have been used on Gaza. Is it the company supplying the bulldozers that are destroying the homes in the West Bank? The company providing the concrete that's building new ones. And so this is where corporate complicity frameworks and domestic legal pathways can tighten over time, especially with the evolution of universal jurisdiction, where cases can be brought as to atrocity crimes, irrespective of where the crime occurred. This occurred in Germany with Syria. We've seen it in other countries as well throughout Europe. And that's where fiduciary breach claims also come from. And so there is a risk that someone could be subject to either civil or even criminal litigation. And later this year, we'll be releasing a very in-depth legal white paper on these issues. We have an incredible team of experts from around the world who's come together and is working on this now, and hope to have that out likely by June.
Well, we'll keep an eye out for that, Sarah. But in the meantime, returning to my scenario as the would-be investor, I need now to be concerned about fiduciary breach. That's me not looking after the best interests of my shareholders, for example. I need to think about corporate complicity, due diligence. What else should I be worried about?
And then the final thing is simply the market risk. Israel's sovereign debt has been used to finance the war, to finance settlements. You have aspects of US law that strongly benefit those, in the US with tax breaks and other things if there's money being sent back to Israel. But if politics change, if leadership changes, that can impact all of this. And so that then poses as well a risk to anything coming out of the West Bank settlements. You have sanctions exposure, reputational contagion as well. And if large funds start to shift and move out of these areas, liquidity disappears and it can shift the entire market if this hopefully grows to that point.
Well, Sarah, you've mentioned the U.S., and of course, Trump is four square behind Israel. Now, that's a very big friend for the Israelis to have. And as your paper notes, his administration is putting maximum pressure on preventing this investment.
It's it's true. And I think, as we see even more arms deals being finalized, rampant support for, even just the continuing atrocities that are happening. And the unfortunate aspect is that the US pressure is political and financial, not legal. The US factor is real. And a lot of that is simply because many corporations are headquartered or have corporate ties to the US, or just the simple nature of the global financial system, with so much being tied to the US dollar, that they run the risk of facing, not being allowed to use the US banking system, which is becoming less and less of a threat as the world expands. But again, as I mentioned, this kind of governance trap where if you have a board who is trying to comply with an EU directive about divestment in West Bank settlements versus US pressure that threatens litigation or prosecution if you divest in settlements. This can create delays. It can cause problems in boards determining what do they do, governance structures. And so, whilst US pressure might be intimidating, it doesn't override EU law, international law, or fiduciary obligations. And so I think this is where you might see corporations shifting. And we've even seen in the last year with the sanctions on the ICC, where a number of entities globally, in a way, are divesting from the US. They're halting their use of US tech companies or other service providers because they have decided that it is not worth having to deal with the US regulatory pressure in these types of circumstances.
I'm just thinking, too, Sarah, that the ICC judges have been sanctioned by the Trump administration. But on the other hand, the EU seems to be finding its backbone and standing up to America, and we saw that with Greenland. So perhaps there's some optimism to be had there. And as you suggest, there is legislation in place, and investors may start to look at that and say, well, it's not. You know what? It's really not worth the trouble. And the U.S. dollar is not the almighty dollar that it once was. But the other thing is, Sarah, that the public attitude towards Israel has shifted very markedly, and this is something you talk about in the Bystanders No More report. What does that do? How does that help to push things forward in terms of encouraging investors to back away from the settlements, to back away from Israel?
It's certainly a really powerful factor. And I think, as we've seen with so many companies who have made the decision to stop doing business with Israel, and have then shifted even to donating money to Palestinian relief and trying to help just the dire situation there, because they saw what happened to their profits. They saw that people were stopping buying their products, were going elsewhere. We're in a world where I don't think anyone has a monopoly on anything, and there will always be someone else to step in. We have Gaza Cola now versus Coca-Cola. And so I think as investors and those making the decisions look at these risks of public pressure, of reputation, of being on that shamed list, it has consequences. It has consequences to their profits, their returns to investors. Uh, and so even stepping aside from the liability, I think that's why these public pressures are so important and making sure people do speak up about this. So when public settlement sentiment really hardens and legal findings are widely known, I think these institutions become more and more vulnerable to what is their reputational risk, and are they willing to kind of try to stay the course, or do they see the benefits of if they shift course And then people then grow in their support for these companies and increase profitability. And I think a lot of what the research is showing is that when corporations do engage, and even going outside of this particular context, when corporations do engage in good practices and moral practices and ethical practices around the world, their profitability increases.
Interesting, because for all those people who go out on the marches, the peaceful protesters, they might have a sense, well, the genocide continues. Are we actually accomplishing anything? But you make a very good point that yes, it is a pressure point, and yes, companies, these corporations, do respond and do feel the pressure. I want to ask you though about the UK government and Prime Minister Starmer. How would you describe this government's treatment, this prime minister's treatment of Palestine and the Palestinian people? Because I'm thinking about things like Palestine Action. You've got what, 2,000 people have now been charged, for supporting a quote terrorist organization. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's terrifying actually, as much as we sit back and criticize what's happening across the pond with President Trump. I don't think people realize how frightening what is even happening within our own borders is. And you touched on Palestine Action is a key example of this. And it's striking that we have someone who is trained as a human rights lawyer, talks the language of international law, while systematically insulates Israel from consequences for any of its action, whilst at the same time pressing forward with a double standard vis-a-vis how the UK has treated Russia and any entity engaging in business or financial dealings with Russia. The government posture on this, I think the arms trade litigation that's ongoing as to UK arms trade to Israel. Yes, the UK did suspend some of the licenses. It was a proper move. It was a good move, but not everything. And as we see UK institutions selling some Israeli sovereign debt, tightening their screens, but the leadership continues to just steadfastly stand behind Israel, refuse to use the word genocide. It's something they say only a court can make a determination. And I think that years from now, when we look back, we will see the failings of this government, that they could have done something, that they had obligations under the Genocide Convention, and they utterly disregarded and ignored those obligations and all of the warnings and allowed this not only to happen, but to continue and to go on and to have the support of the UK government in it.
Yeah, history will record those failings. And I would add, Sarah, that it's not just the government that refuses to use the word genocide to describe what is going on in Gaza, but it is media institutions, including the BBC, who will not describe and use the word genocide. And Sarah, you have a paper coming out. We'll keep an eye out for that. And I thank you for the work you and your cohort are doing. It's an important area. And I suppose the lesson for people listening is those who support Palestine and the Palestinians' cause for justice is don't give up hope. There are still plenty of weapons in the arsenal to force change upon our government here and indeed governments elsewhere. And for those pension funds, corporate entities with investments in Israel, in the West Bank settlements, take a closer look. If you won't consider the moral issue, the ethics of it, consider the bottom line. And for those who are thinking about investing, well, think again.
Brilliantly said. Completely agree.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you, Bill.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was the human rights lawyer, Sara Segneri, who specializes in sanctions law and international financial crime. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. No sponsors, no advertising. Our support comes only from our subscribers. With all that's going on in the world and the huge challenges independent media is facing as the US and other democracies tilt towards authoritarianism, we need your help. We need your support. Head to the website, arabdigest.org. See what we have to offer you with our team of analysts, commentators, and writers. folks you will not find anywhere else. And while you're there, check out our offer of a free 2-month trial to our reader-supported daily newsletter. Follow us on Facebook's X and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. The podcast has had more than 250,000 listens since our launch, and we thank you for listening today. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest, essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.